The history of maritime disasters is dominated by the name Titanic, a story of luxury, meeting an iceberg in the North Atlantic. But there is another name, buried in the dark, freezing currents of the Baltic Sea, that represents a tragedy 6 times larger, a loss of life so staggering it defies human comprehension. This is the story of the Wilhelm Gustloff. It is a narrative that intertwines a massive humanitarian disaster, the brutal endgame of World War II, and the enduring mystery of the Amber Room, the world's most valuable lost treasure. The Wilhelm Gustloff was not just a ship. It was a floating microcosm of the Third Reich's rise and its catastrophic fall. The ship was launched in 1937 as the flagship of the Kraft durch Freude, Strength Through Joy program. Designed as a luxury cruise liner for the German working class, it was a centerpiece of Nazi propaganda, meant to show the world that Hitler's regime provided equality and leisure for all. It was 684 feet of gleaming white steel, built to carry nearly 2,000 passengers in unprecedented comfort. For 2 years, it sailed the Mediterranean and the North Sea, a symbol of German industrial pride. But when the fires of World War II were ignited in 1939, the Gustloff was stripped of its luxury. It became a hospital ship, then a floating barracks for the 2nd Submarine Training Division in the port of Gottenhafen. For 4 years, it sat static, a grey ghost of its former self, while the world burned around it. By January 1945, the 1,000-year Reich was collapsing. On the Eastern Front, the Soviet Red Army had broken through the German lines and was sweeping into East Prussia with a vengeance fueled by years of brutal occupation. Millions of German civilians, women, children, and the elderly, found themselves trapped between the advancing Soviet tanks and the freezing shores of the Baltic. Their only hope for survival was the sea. The German High Command launched Operation Hannibal, the largest maritime evacuation in history. Every ship that could still float, from massive liners to tiny fishing trawlers, was pressed into service to ferry refugees to the relative safety of the West. The Wilhelm Gustloff was the centerpiece of this desperate exodus. On the morning of January 30th, 1945, ironically the 12th anniversary of Hitler's rise to power, the ship was docked in Gottenhafen, its decks swarmed by a panicked, freezing mass of humanity. The ship was designed to carry 1,800 people. By the time the gangplanks were raised, the official count was 6,000. But modern historians, analyzing the chaos of the boarding process, estimate the true number was closer to 10,600 people. Thousands of children were hidden in the luggage holds. Refugees were packed into the empty swimming pools and tiled hallways, and the decks were so crowded that movement was impossible. As the lines were cast off, the atmosphere on board was a mixture of terror and profound relief. They believed they had escaped the Red Army, but the Gustloff was stepping into a lethal trap. The ship was dangerously overloaded, its engines were struggling, and it was escorted by only a single lightly armed torpedo boat. To make matters worse, the German captains were divided. One wanted to sail in the shallow coastal waters to avoid submarines. The other insisted on the deep water channels to avoid mines. They chose the deep water. It was a fatal mistake. Waiting in the dark, icy depths of the Baltic was S-13, a Soviet S-class submarine commanded by Alexander Marinesko. Marinesko was a man looking for redemption, a captain who had been threatened with a court-martial and saw a big kill as his only way to survive the Soviet bureaucracy. Through his periscope, he saw the lights of a massive German transport ship cutting through the blizzard. He didn't see a refugee ship. He saw a legitimate military target filled with Nazi personnel. He began to maneuver into position, ordering his crew to prepare 4 torpedoes. On the side of the torpedoes, the Soviet sailors had painted messages in red, for the motherland, for Leningrad, and for the Soviet people. Inside the Gustloff, the thousands of refugees were trying to find sleep in the freezing cold, unaware that 3 of those steel fish were about to tear the world apart. This was the beginning of a night where the Baltic Sea would become a tomb for over 9,000 souls, and where a treasure worth billions, the legendary Amber Room, would reportedly vanish into the silt of history. The Amber Requiem was about to begin, and it would leave a scar on the history of the sea that would never heal. The night of January 30th, 1945, was a symphony of cold and terror. At 9:08 p.m., the Wilhelm Gustloff was struggling through a blizzard, her hull encrusted with ice, cutting through waves that were just above freezing. Inside, nearly 10,600 human beings were packed like sardines, the air thick with the smell of wet wool, sweat, and fear. Below the surface, Captain Alexander Marinesko of the Soviet submarine S-13 gave the order that would change maritime history forever. He released a spread of 4 torpedoes. One jammed in its tube, a quirk of fate, but 3 others hissed through the dark, icy water at 40 knots, their explosive warheads destined for the port side of the German giant. The first torpedo, inscribed with the words, "For the Motherland," struck the Gustloff near the bow. The impact was so violent that it didn't just breach the hull, it disintegrated the crew quarters where off-duty sailors were sleeping. Hundreds were killed instantly in their bunks, vaporized by the initial blast or drowned within seconds, as the Baltic Sea rushed in through a gaping hole the size of a house. But the true horror was only beginning. The second torpedo, for Leningrad, hit the ship directly amidships, striking the area of the glass-enclosed promenade deck and the empty indoor swimming pool. This second impact was a masterpiece of unintentional cruelty. The swimming pool had been drained and turned into a temporary barracks for hundreds of young women, members of the Women's Naval Auxiliary. When the torpedo detonated, the tiled walls of the pool shattered into thousands of razor-sharp ceramic shards, acting like shrapnel. The blast combined with the shrapnel and the sudden influx of freezing water created a meat grinder effect. Those who weren't killed by the explosion were trapped in a pit of rising water, unable to climb the slick, broken tiles as the ship began to tilt. Their screams echoed through the ship's interior, a haunting chorus that many survivors would hear in their nightmares for the rest of their lives. The third torpedo, for the Soviet people, struck the engine room. This was the death blow. The explosion tore through the massive diesel engines, instantly cutting all electrical power to the ship. In a heartbeat, the Wilhelm Gustloff was plunged into total, absolute darkness. The thousands of refugees trapped in the lower decks, mostly mothers and children, suddenly found themselves in a lightless labyrinth that was rapidly filling with water. The panic was instantaneous and primal. With no emergency lights, the only way to navigate was by touch and the terrifying sound of the sea rushing through the bulkheads. As the ship began to list heavily to port, the internal environment of the Gustloff turned into a scene from Dante's Inferno. Because the ship was so overloaded, the stairwells became bottlenecks of death. Stronger men pushed over the elderly. Mothers lost their grip on their children's hands in the dark, never to find them again. Those who managed to reach the upper decks found a new horror. The temperature outside was nearly 18 degrees Celsius. The decks were coated in a thick layer of ice, making it almost impossible to stand. The lifeboats, which were the only hope for thousands, were frozen solid into their davits. The struggle to launch the boats was a futile battle against physics. Sailors and refugees used axes and knives to hack away at the ice, but the ship's increasing tilt meant that the boats on the starboard side could not be lowered at all. They simply swung inward against the hull. On the port side, several lifeboats were lowered too quickly in the panic, dumping their human cargo into the freezing waves 40 feet below. The water was so cold that cold shock killed hundreds within minutes. Their hearts simply stopped as they hit the slushy surface of the Baltic. Within 30 minutes of the first impact, the Wilhelm Gustloff was leaning so far over that people were sliding across the icy decks and falling into the sea by the hundreds. The unsinkable propaganda tool of the Nazi Party was now a vertical coffin. At the bow, the ship's siren began to wail. A short circuit caused it to blow continuously, a mournful mechanical scream that signaled the end. Historians have noted that the most tragic aspect of this phase was the children's deck. Because it was a refugee mission, there were over 4,000 infants and children on board. In the chaos of the sinking, the heavy winter coats the children wore, meant to save them from the cold, became their anchors. As the ship submerged, the air trapped in the coats caused many children to float upside down, their heads underwater while their feet remained at the surface. For the survivors watching from the few successful lifeboats, the sight of thousands of small floating figures in the dark water was a trauma that transcended the politics of war. As the Gustloff made her final plunge, she didn't go quietly. The internal bulkheads gave way with the sound of thunder, and the remaining air trapped inside hissed out like a dying breath. At 10:18 p.m., just 70 minutes after the first torpedo hit, the stern of the ship rose high into the air, silhouetted against the winter stars, and then slid beneath the waves. She took with her nearly 9,000 people. To put this in perspective, the Titanic lost 2,500. The Gustloff was a catastrophe on a scale that dwarfed every other maritime disaster in human history. But as the ship settled onto the seabed 45 meters down, a new mystery began. Among the cargo reportedly loaded in secret at Gotenhafen were several heavy, mysterious crates. Some believe they contained the disassembled panels of the Amber Room, the stolen treasure of the Russian Tsars. As the survivors struggled in the water, and the Soviet submarine S-13 slipped away into the dark, the Wilhelm Gustloff became more than a shipwreck. She became a tomb for 10,000 people, and perhaps the greatest lost treasure of the 20th century. The Baltic Sea had closed over the Reich's greatest tragedy, and the silence that followed was the coldest sound on earth. The moment the Wilhelm Gustloff vanished beneath the churning, slush-filled waves of the Baltic, the sea did not fall silent. Instead, it became a landscape of agonizing noise, the screams of thousands of people thrashing in water, so cold it felt like liquid fire. The temperature of the Baltic that night was hovering just above freezing, around 4 °C, while the air temperature was a lethal 18 °C. For the nearly 2,000 people who managed to get off the ship before it went down, the struggle for life was only beginning. They were now participants in a biological countdown. In conditions this extreme, the human body has less than 5 to 10 minutes before hypothermia shuts down the heart. The first vessel to arrive at the scene of the massacre was the torpedo boat T-36. Its captain, Robert Herring, steered his ship into a literal field of corpses. The beam of the T-36's searchlight cut through the blizzard, revealing a sight that Herring later described as an ocean of white faces. Thousands of people were bobbing in the water, held up by their life jackets, but most were already dead, their eyes frozen open and their skin turned a ghostly blue. The searchlight moved across the waves, catching the desperate waving of hands from the few overcrowded lifeboats that hadn't capsized. Herring knew he had to act fast, but he was also in extreme danger. The Soviet submarine S-13 was still lurking somewhere in the darkness, looking for a second kill. The rescue process was a nightmare of logistics and physics. Sailors on the T-36 and the torpedo boat lowered cargo nets over the sides, screaming at the survivors to climb. But the survivors' hands were so frozen they couldn't grip the ropes. Men and women would reach for the nets, their fingers literal blocks of ice only to slip back into the sea and disappear. The German sailors had to lean over the railings, risking their own lives to grab people by their hair or clothing and haul them upward. As the survivors were pulled onto the decks, they didn't look like people. They looked like ice sculptures. Their clothes were frozen stiff, and many had to be literally broken out of their coats. Inside the small torpedo boats, the scenes were chaotic. Every available inch of floor space was covered with shivering, traumatized refugees. There were no doctors, no medicine, and very little blankets. Mothers who had been pulled from the water were screaming for children they had lost in the darkness. One of the most haunting stories from the T-36 involves a sailor who reached down to grab what he thought was a bundle of rags floating in the water. As he pulled it up, he realized it was a small infant wrapped in a fur coat, miraculously still breathing because the air trapped in the fur had kept it afloat. It was one of the few miracles in a night defined by absolute loss. As the sun began to rise over the Baltic on January 31st, the rescue ships were forced to flee. Radar signatures suggested more Soviet submarines were closing in. Captain Herring had to make the agonizing decision to leave behind those still in the water. The T-36 and the lower limped toward the port of Sassnitz, carrying roughly 1,200 survivors between them. Out of the estimated 10,600 people who had boarded in Gotenhafen, Nearly 9,400 had perished. It was a survival rate of barely 10%. By comparison, the Titanic had a survival rate of 32%. When the news of the disaster reached the high-ranking Nazi officials in Berlin, the reaction was not one of mourning, but of calculated silence. Joseph Goebbels, the Minister of Propaganda, immediately ordered a total media blackout. The German public was not to know that their largest ship had been sunk with 4,000 children on board. The regime feared that such news would shatter the already fragile morale of the civilian population. The survivors were sworn to secrecy under threat of death. There were no national funerals, no radio broadcasts of mourning, and no flags at half-mast. The Wilhelm Gustloff was to be erased from history as if it had never existed. But for the survivors, the trauma could not be erased. They were haunted not just by the sinking, but by the cold. Survivors spoke of the sound of the ice cracking against the ship's hull, a sound that would trigger panic attacks for decades. They spoke of the death silence that fell over the water after the first 20 minutes, as the screaming stopped, and the thousands of victims succumbed to the cold. They were the living ghosts of a catastrophe that the world chose to ignore for 50 years because they were the enemy. While the survivors were being processed in refugee camps, a different kind of investigation was starting in the secret offices of the Soviet and East German intelligence services. They weren't interested in the death toll. They were interested in the cargo manifest. Reports from dock workers in Gotenhafen began to circulate about heavy wooden crates marked with state property seals that had been loaded into the Gustloff's lower holds under heavy SS guard just hours before departure. The rumor began to take root. The ship hadn't just been carrying people. It had been the final transport for the Amber Room, the stolen $500 million treasure of the Russian Tsars. As the Gustloff sat on the seabed, she became the ultimate prize of the Cold War, a tomb of 10,000 souls and a vault of stolen gold. The rescue was over, the cover-up was in place, but the mystery of what lay inside the rusted hull was just beginning to breathe. The Wilhelm Gustloff had become a forbidden wreck, a place where history, death, and greed were about to collide in the dark, pressurized silt of the Baltic Deep. To understand why the Wilhelm Gustloff is more than just a mass grave, one must understand the obsession that drove both the Nazi High Command and the Soviet secret police, the quest for the Amber Room. Originally gifted by the King of Prussia to Peter the Great in 1716, the Amber Room was a masterpiece of Baroque art, a chamber composed entirely of amber panels backed with gold leaf and adorned with gemstones. For over 2 centuries it stood in the Catherine Palace near St. Petersburg, a symbol of Russian imperial splendor, valued today at over $500 million. When the German Wehrmacht invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, the Amber Room was their primary cultural target. Within 36 hours of reaching the palace, Nazi art experts disassembled the room, packed it into 27 massive crates, and shipped it to Königsberg, East Prussia. By early 1945, Königsberg was under siege. The man in charge of the treasure, Gauleiter Erich Koch, was desperate to move the panels further west before the Red Army could reclaim them. This is where the path of the world's most valuable treasure intersects with the doomed Wilhelm Gustloff. According to eyewitness testimony from dockworkers and high-ranking German officers who survived the war, a series of heavy, unmarked crates were transported from the Königsberg Castle to the docks of Gotenhafen under the highest level of SS security. These crates were not part of the standard refugee cargo. They were moved at night, bypasses all civilian manifests, and were allegedly stowed in the lower armored holds of the Gustloff, just beneath the area where the second torpedo would later strike. The evidence for this ghost cargo is not merely conspiratorial, it is rooted in the strategic movements of the SS. The Gustloff was one of the few ships with the structural capacity and the naval escort, however minimal, to transport such a massive weight. Furthermore, the Soviet Union's behavior after the war speaks volumes. While the world focused on the humanitarian tragedy, the Soviet GRU and the Stasi, East German secret police, spent decades conducting clandestine investigations into the wreck. During the Cold War, the Soviet Navy declared the area around the Gustloff a closed zone. Unauthorized ships were warned that they would be fired upon. Soviet divers operating in secrecy were sent down to the wreck multiple times between the 1950s and the 1970s. What were they looking for? These Soviet diving teams weren't there to recover the bones of refugees. They were there with cutting torches. Modern sonar scans and private diving expeditions conducted after the fall of the Iron Curtain revealed that the hull of the Wilhelm Gustloff had been systematically ventilated. Large sections of the steel plating over the cargo holds had been cut away from the outside, a task that would have required professional military diving equipment and weeks of undisturbed labor. The prevailing theory among treasure hunters is that the Soviets may have actually found the crates, but the condition of the amber, which is extremely fragile and prone to crumbling when exposed to changing pressure and salt water, meant that they might have recovered nothing but golden dust and rotted wood. Yet some believe the treasure is still there, protected by the very tragedy that sank it. The Gustloff did not settle on the bottom in one piece. When the torpedoes struck and the ship eventually plunged, the internal decks collapsed under the weight of thousands of tons of water and the shift of the engines. The lower holds, where the amber room would have been stored, are now a crushed sandwich of steel, silt, and human remains. To reach them would require a massive salvage operation that is legally and ethically impossible, as the wreck is now an official war grave protected by international law. The amber panels, if they survived the initial explosions and the 45-meter plunge, are likely buried under the weight of 10,000 souls, fused into a single mass of rust and resin. The mystery of the amber room transforms the Wilhelm Gustloff from a historical footnote into a dark legend. It creates a narrative where the highest achievement of European art is inextricably linked to the lowest point of European humanity. For those who dive the wreck today, mostly illegal wreck raiders or authorized archaeological teams, the atmosphere is one of heavy, oppressive silence. You are swimming through a tomb that might also be a vault. Every time a diver sees a glint of something orange in the silt, their heart stops, wondering if they have found a piece of the Tsar's lost glory. But the Baltic is a jealous guardian. Whether the amber room was recovered by the Soviets in secret, or whether it is currently dissolving in the darkness, it remains the ghost of the Gustloff, a shimmering, golden dream buried in a nightmare of ice and iron. The search for the amber room has cost lives, ruined reputations, and fueled endless books and films, but the ship refuses to give up its final secret. As the hull continues to deteriorate, the chances of ever finding the crates intact diminish to zero. The Wilhelm Gustloff remains the ultimate paradox of the deep, a place where the value of human life was calculated as zero, while the value of the walls they died within was calculated in the billions. In the end, the amber room may be exactly where it belongs, locked away in a requiem of shadows, forever beyond the reach of the greed that caused its theft and the war that caused its loss. To understand the tragedy of the Wilhelm Gustloff, one must look through the eyes of the man who hunted her down, Captain Alexander Marinesko. In the pantheon of naval history, Marinesko is a figure of violent contradictions, a brilliant tactician, a reckless alcoholic, a Soviet hero, and a disgraced criminal. By January 1945, Marinesko was a man standing on the edge of a precipice. He was the commander of the S-13, a Stalinets-class submarine, but he was also a man marked for the Gulag. Just weeks before his fateful patrol, Marinesko had disappeared for several days during a drunken bender in the port of Turku, Finland, failing to report for duty. In the paranoid, iron-fisted atmosphere of Stalin's Soviet Union, this was desertion. His superior officers were preparing a court-martial that would have likely ended in a firing squad. Marinesko knew that only a miraculous military achievement could save his life. He wasn't just hunting for ships, he was hunting for his own survival. When the S-13 slipped into the freezing, mine-choked waters of the Baltic on its redemption patrol, the tension inside the cramped, oily hull was suffocating. Marinesko was aggressive, pushing his crew and his machine to the absolute limit. He ignored safety protocols, navigating through shallow, ice-cluttered sectors where German patrol boats were known to roam. On the night of January 30th, through the salt-sprayed glass of his periscope, he spotted a massive silhouette. This was the moment he had been praying for. In the dark, blowing snow, he saw the Wilhelm Gustloff, not as a ship filled with 5,000 children, but as a capital ship of the Third Reich, a trophy that would wipe his slate clean in the eyes of the Kremlin. The tactical execution of the attack was chillingly precise. Marinesko didn't just fire from a distance, he maneuvered the S-13 between the Gustloff and the coastline. An incredibly dangerous move that required him to navigate through waters he believed were mined. He wanted to attack from the shoreward side, where the Germans would least expect a submarine. For over 2 hours he stalked the liner, matching its speed, calculating the lead, and waiting for the perfect angle. When he finally gave the command to fire the 3 for the motherland, he wasn't just launching torpedoes. He was launching his bid for the title of Hero of the Soviet Union. The 3 massive explosions that followed were the loudest sounds of his life, but they were followed by a silence that would haunt him for the next 20 years. The aftermath of the sinking did not bring Marinesko the glory he craved. While he had technically achieved the greatest kill in naval history by tonnage and numbers, the Soviet High Command was deeply uneasy. Reports began to filter back through intelligence channels that the ship was packed with civilian refugees. Furthermore, Marinesko's personal behavior remained uncontrollable. Despite his military success, his heavy drinking and insubordination continued. Instead of being showered with medals and parades, he was treated with cold suspicion. The Hero of the Soviet Union title he so desperately wanted was denied. By the end of 1945, he was demoted, stripped of his rank, and eventually dishonorably discharged from the Navy he had served with such lethal efficiency. The descent of Alexander Marinesko into the forgotten corners of the Soviet Union is a story of profound irony. The man who had sent 9,000 people to a frozen grave ended up a broken, destitute laborer. He was sentenced to 3 years in a labor camp, the Gulag, for wastage of socialist property, after a minor incident at a supply depot where he worked. The butcher of the Baltic spent his days hauling coal and living in a cramped, unheated apartment, his name erased from official Soviet naval histories. He became a ghost in his own country, a man who had won the war for his masters, but was too humanly messy for their propaganda machine to utilize. Marinesko died in 1963, a bitter, forgotten alcoholic, succumbing to cancer at the age of 50. He died without ever knowing the full, horrific scale of what he had done that night in January. It wasn't until the era of glasnost in the late 1980s that his story was rediscovered. In 1990, Mikhail Gorbachev finally awarded him the posthumous title of Hero of the Soviet Union, 45 years after the torpedoes left the tubes of the S-13. Today there are statues of Marinesko in Russia, and he is celebrated as a naval genius who struck a decisive blow against the Nazi war machine. But in the West, and among the families of the survivors, he remains a monster, a man who pulled the trigger on a floating nursery to save his own career from a court-martial. The tragedy of Marinesko is that his life and the fate of the Wilhelm Gustloff are forever welded together in the dark silt of the Baltic. He was the instrument of a brutal system, fighting against another brutal system, and the victims were caught in the middle. When you look at the rusted, broken hull of the Gustloff today, you are looking at the legacy of Alexander Marinesko, a man who achieved the impossible and was destroyed by it. He proved that in total war, there is no such thing as a clean kill, and that the weight of 9,000 souls is a burden that no amount of vodka or medals can ever truly lighten. The hunter and the prey now belong to the same history, locked in a requiem of ice, guilt, and the eternal freezing silence of the deep. Today, the Wilhelm Gustloff rests in a shallow, frigid grave exactly 450 meters from the coast of Poland, lying on its port side at a depth of 45 to 48 meters, roughly 150 feet. But this is no longer the pristine luxury liner that slid into the water in 1937. It is a shattered, mangled mountain of iron that has been subjected to decades of military interference, environmental decay, and human greed. Because the wreck lies in the relatively shallow waters of the Baltic continental shelf, it is subject to intense underwater currents and a unique chemical environment. The Baltic Sea is brackish, a mix of salt and fresh water, which means the wood and organic materials inside the ship have been preserved with terrifying clarity, while the steel hull is being devoured by a specific type of iron-eating bacteria that creates rusticles, making the ship look like it is melting into the seabed. The physical condition of the Gustloff is a testament to the violence of the Cold War's aftermath. In the 1950s and 60s, the Soviet Navy, obsessed with the Amber Room and other Nazi secrets, didn't just dive the wreck, they practiced demolition archaeology. They used heavy underwater explosives to blast through the hull to gain access to the lower cargo holds. As a result, the midsection of the ship is a chaotic jumble of collapsed decks and twisted girders. When modern sonar mapping was conducted in the early 2000s, it revealed that the ship had been virtually gutted. The grand staircases, the tiled swimming pool where so many died, and the luxurious ballrooms are now a compressed sandwich of metal, crushed by the weight of the sea and the force of Soviet dynamite. However, the most disturbing chapter in the wreck's modern history occurred in the 1990s. Following the collapse of the Soviet Union, the forbidden zone around the Gustloff became a lawless frontier for wreck raiders and illegal treasure hunters. For nearly a decade, unregulated diving teams from across Europe flocked to the site, driven by the myth of the Amber Room and the lucrative market for Nazi memorabilia. These looters didn't just take artifacts, they desecrated the site. They entered the corridor of death, the long hallways where the skeletons of thousands of refugees were still trapped, and pushed aside human remains to reach cabins and storage lockers. They stripped the ship of its brass telegraphs, its porcelain plates marked with the Kraftdeutsche Freude logo, and even personal jewelry from the victims. This great looting turned a sacred war grave into an underwater crime scene, leading the Polish government to eventually declare the wreck a formal war grave in 1994, strictly forbidding any diving within a 500-meter radius without high-level military authorization. Despite the human interference, nature has begun its own eerie transformation of the Wilhelm Gustloff. The wreck sits in a dead zone of the Baltic, an area with very low oxygen levels. This has created a paradoxical environment. While it slows down the decay of some materials, it also attracts specific ghostly forms of life. The hull is now entirely encrusted in a thick, pale carpet of plumose anemones and blue mussels. From a distance, the ship doesn't look like metal. It looks like a giant, white, pulsating organism. Inside the broken windows of the bridge, cod and eel swim through the silt, their eyes catching the light of a diver's torch like sparks in the dark. The ship has become a steel reef, a massive biological hub that provides a home for the sea's predators, who now haunt the same corridors where 4,000 children once sought shelter from a blizzard. The atmosphere inside the wreck is described by authorized divers as heavy and oppressive. Because of the shallow depth, the light from the surface filtered through the green, murky water creates a perpetual twilight. The silt on the floor is extremely fine. A single misplaced kick of a fin can black out a room in seconds, trapping a diver in a cloud of dust that was once the furniture, clothing, and remains of the passengers. In the silt of the lower decks, you can still see the outlines of suitcases, their leather long since rotted away, but their metal frames still holding the shape of the dreams people tried to carry with them to freedom. You see the remains of baby carriages, wheels stuck in the mud, and thousands of shoes. The leather of shoes is particularly resistant to the sea, leaving behind a haunting trail of footprints through the ship's interior. The Wilhelm Gustloff is currently in a state of terminal collapse. The Polish Maritime Office monitors the wreck annually, noting that the hull is bending under its own massive weight. Experts predict that within the next 50 to 100 years, the upper decks will completely pancake onto the lower holds, sealing the Amber Room mystery and the remains of the 9,000 victims forever in a solid block of rust. It is a race against time, between the historians trying to document the site and the ocean trying to erase it. The ship remains a forbidden kingdom, a place where the tragedy of 1945 is being slowly digested by the Baltic, turning a monument of human cruelty into a silent, white-covered mountain of coral and memory. It is a tomb that refuses to stay quiet, but one that the world is finally learning to respect as a place of absolute, frozen rest. The Wilhelm Gustloff does not just rest in the silt of the Baltic. It rests at the center of a volatile geopolitical and ethical intersection. For decades, the wreck has been a stateless phantom, claimed by the ghosts of the Third Reich, the naval records of the Soviet Union, and the territorial waters of modern-day Poland. This legal quagmire has turned the ship into a diplomatic battlefield. Because the ship was a German vessel, carrying both military personnel and civilians, sunk by a Soviet submarine, and now situated in Polish waters, the question of ownership is a nightmare of international law. To the German families, it is a Kriegsgräberstätte, a war grave that should be left in absolute peace. To the Russian state, it is a site of a great patriotic war victory, a trophy of the defeat of fascism. To the Poles, it is a dangerous, polluting monument to an occupation they wish to forget, yet are forced to protect. The ethical battle reached a boiling point with the rise of modern, technical diving. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, as equipment allowed humans to stay longer and deeper, the Gustloff became the Mount Everest of wreck diving, but a Mount Everest littered with the bones of children. The dilemma is agonizing. Do we allow archaeologists to enter the ship to salvage the amber room, or historical documents that could rewrite the history of 1945? Or do we enforce a total no-touch policy, essentially saying that the curiosity of the living is worth less than the dignity of the dead? In 1994, Poland officially designated the wreck as a forbidden zone, placing it under the protection of the Maritime office in Gdynia. Today, any ship approaching the coordinates is tracked by coastal radar. Unauthorized divers face massive fines and imprisonment. Yet, the black market for Gustloff artifacts continues to thrive in the dark corners of the internet, where a single porcelain plate with the ship's logo can fetch thousands of dollars, a ghoulish trade that fuels illegal midnight expeditions. Beyond the legalities, there is the psychology of the ghost. Among the fishing communities of the Polish coast and the specialized divers who have been granted rare permits to survey the hull, the Wilhelm Gustloff has earned a reputation for being spiritually heavy. Divers often report a phenomenon known as the silent scream, an overwhelming sense of dread and claustrophobia that occurs even in the wide-open areas of the wreck. Some attribute this to infrasound, low-frequency vibrations caused by the way the Baltic currents whistle through the jagged, torn steel of the torpedo holes, which is known to induce feelings of anxiety and hallucinations in humans. Others, however, believe it is the psychic residue of 9,000 souls who were extinguished in a single hour of absolute terror. There are also the ghost lights of the Baltic. For decades, sailors have reported seeing strange, flickering luminescence over the coordinates of the sinking during the winter months. While scientists explain this as bioluminescence or phosphorus rising from the decaying organic matter of the ship's cargo, local legend has a different take. They say it is the amber light, the reflection of the lost treasure still trying to signal its location through the murky green water. These myths have turned the Gustloff into a modern-day Flying Dutchman, a ship that is physically stationary but continues to sail through the collective trauma of Northern Europe. The most controversial aspect of the Gustloff's legacy remains the taboo of German suffering. For 50 years, the story of the sinking was suppressed in the West to avoid appearing to victimize the Germans after the horrors of the Holocaust. To talk about the 4,000 children who drowned on the Gustloff was seen as a way of distracting from the crimes of the Nazi regime. But as the survivors grew old and the Cold War ended, the silence broke. The ship became a symbol of the universal victim. The idea that a child drowning in the Baltic is a tragedy that transcends the uniform their father wore. This shift in perspective has made the Gustloff a focal point for reconciliation, where German, Polish, and Russian historians now meet to document the wreck, not as a military target, but as a monument to the failure of humanity. As the wreck continues to pancake, with the heavy upper deck slowly crushing the lower cabins into a singular layer of compressed rust, the legal and ethical battles are becoming a race against time. Poland has debated entombing the ship in a layer of concrete, similar to what was proposed for the MS Estonia, to prevent further looting and to seal the amber room forever. But for now, the ship remains exposed, a jagged, anemone-covered mountain of iron that serves as a warning. It is a place where the requiem is played by the currents, and the amber is guarded by the bones of the innocent. It is a forbidden kingdom, where history refuses to be buried, and where the dead continue to demand that the living never forget the cost of total war. As we reach the final horizon of the Wilhelm Gustloff saga, we are left staring into a dark, pressurized abyss, where the line between historical fact and legendary myth has completely dissolved. The ship is no longer merely a maritime disaster. It has become a profound rusting metaphor for the 20th century. A century of industrial progress that culminated in industrial-scale slaughter. As the 21st century advances, the endgame for the Gustloff is approaching, driven by the relentless laws of chemistry and the inescapable weight of memory. The ship is entering its final phase of existence, a slow-motion collapse that will eventually seal its secrets away from human eyes forever, leaving only the cold, green water of the Baltic to guard its legacy. The final conclusion to the Amber Room mystery is perhaps the most somber element of this finale. After 80 years of clandestine Soviet dives, illegal wreck-raiding expeditions, and high-tech sonar sweeps, the most likely reality is a tragic one. Amber is not a gemstone. It is fossilized resin. It is incredibly sensitive to thermal shock and chemical changes. When the 3 Soviet torpedoes tore into the Gustloff's portside, the resulting explosions would have sent shockwaves through the hull that likely shattered the fragile amber panels into millions of unrecognizable shards. Even if the panels survived the blast, the 80 years of immersion in the brackish, pressurized environment of the Baltic, combined with the crushing weight of the ship's internal collapse, has likely reduced the 8th wonder of the world to a layer of orange dust, mixed inextricably with the silt and the bones of the refugees. The treasure did not escape the war. It died with the people who were forced to carry it. Environmentally, the Wilhelm Gustloff is reaching a point of structural exhaustion. The iron-eating bacteria and the corrosive salt are winning. Recent surveys by the Polish Maritime Office show that the hull is hogging, bending in the middle like an old spine. Within the next few decades, the massive stern and bow sections will likely shear off, causing the remains of the ship to slide further down the sloping seabed into deeper, oxygen-poor water. This collapse is a ticking time bomb for the Baltic's ecology. Like the ghost fleet of Truk Lagoon, the Gustloff still carries remnants of heavy fuel oil and thousands of rounds of unexploded anti-aircraft ammunition. A catastrophic structural failure could release a plume of toxins into a sea that is already struggling with the legacy of dumped chemical weapons from the Second World War. Philosophically, the Wilhelm Gustloff stands as the most important ship the world tried to forget. For half a century, the 9,400 souls who died that night were inconvenient victims. Their story didn't fit the clean narrative of a good war. But as we look at the wreck today, we see a universal warning. The ship teaches us that in the machinery of total war, the civilian is always the primary casualty. The 4,000 children who drowned in the Gustloff are a haunting reminder that the amber of national pride and stolen treasure is never worth the blood of the innocent. The ship serves as a permanent underwater cenotaph for the millions of displaced people, refugees, and collateral victims of the 1940s. A reminder that the sea makes no distinction between the victor and the vanquished. Today, the coordinates 55°07 and 17°41 are more than a spot on a nautical chart. They are a place of profound frozen silence. The forbidden wreck has finally earned its title. Protected by international law and the natural barriers of the deep, the Wilhelm Gustloff is now returning to the earth. The anemones that cover its hull are the only flowers these victims will ever have. The rhythmic pulse of the Baltic currents is their only eulogy. When the final deck eventually pancakes and the last light of a diver's torch fades from the corridor of death, the ship will be gone, but the lesson will remain. The Amber Requiem is a story with no heroes, only a vast cold ocean and the echoes of a scream that was silenced by the ice. It is a story that demands we look into the dark and acknowledge that even in our most brutal moments, the loss of 10,000 lives is a weight that the world must carry forever. The Wilhelm Gustloff is at rest now, a tomb of iron, a vault of dust, and a mirror held up to the darkest parts of the human soul. The Baltic Sea has claimed its prize, and as the silt settles for the final time, the greatest maritime tragedy in history finally finds the peace that the world above could never provide.